Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoterica and our continuing series on the MiSTer FPGA DE-10 Nano project. And because you guys have been asking for so many of these comparisons, today we're going to be taking the MiSTer FPGA core for Game Boy Advance and putting it up directly against MGBA on the Raspberry Pi 4 because Game Boy Advance games are absolutely spectacular on MiSTer, so let's see how MiSTer compares to the Raspberry Pi 4. And I do love doing these comparisons, but if you could do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like, subscribe, and that notification bell, definitely help us out. And if you feel so inclined to want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. But off the top, I don't have anything terrible to say about MGBA on the Raspberry Pi 4. I have noticed some issues with the core compared to MiSTer, but they aren't fundamentally game-breaking, and I will get into them more as we go along. But as we go from the MGBA core on RetroPie and RetroArch to the MiSTer core, I enjoy the colors that MiSTer's putting out much better than I do compared to MGBA. Now, colors can be adjusted. I am reviewing these based on the stock specifications if you just load the emulator up or the core up on MiSTer, and you'll see as we go over to the Raspberry Pi, everything loses some vibrancy, and something like Wario World on the Game Boy Advance, it was always a very vibrant and colorful game. But what I love doing is comparing cutscenes where you don't have any control over the action. I keyframe these into a particular frame to see if the software emulation is getting faster or slower. And what I do find out in the Game Boy Advance at least is that Raspberry Pi on the MGBA core and RetroArch does like to start to run ahead by 2 to 3 frames. Now, I don't have a capture device for my Game Boy Advance, but I did shoot it on my camera and I brought it into the editing system and compared it to MiSTer, and that synced up. But you'll see here on the right, this cutscene is starting to get ahead of MiSTer, and that is unfortunate. It is not a game breaker because you're not playing the cutscenes. You would probably never know if I didn't show this to you, but it does lead into some situations where the software emulation accuracy might be slightly off compared to original hardware. It is not going to affect the gameplay because honestly, gameplay wise, I found no issue with software emulation on the Raspberry Pi 4, but I do wish stuff like the cutscenes would stay consistent across the board because you do get that run ahead. But you'll see here side by side, this is what I'm talking about when I say the colors on MiSTer are just much more pleasing to my eye. And I understand that color is a very subjective thing. Maybe the Raspberry Pi source on the right is more to your liking. You get to decide what you like. But to me, at least for this game, MiSTer is definitely taking the crown as far as the way I would like to play it if I'm not using original hardware. And that's kind of what you have to ask yourself. But moving on to something else, Mega Man on the Game Boy Advance, this is another game where the colors are just a little bit unsaturated to my eye. And like I said, I know we can adjust that, and I will certainly do videos in the future showing you how to dial in specific cores on the Raspberry Pi. But if we move over to MiSTer, the reds, the yellows, the purples, even the grays and browns are more what I think this game should look like. But the best way to talk about it is to put up a side-by-side comparison, which you will see now, and you will see that orange is a deeper orange. It's a little bit more vibrant on the MiSTer side. It's just like the Raspberry Pi, and it's not the Pi itself, it's the core on RetroArch, is just kind of crushing down the colors ever so slightly. Now, if I play this game again on an original Game Boy Advance, and it is screen modded, so it's a new screen, I expect those vibrant colors, and I wish I was getting them here. Again, this doesn't affect gameplay whatsoever. These two games are playing identically, so if you have no issues with slight color shift, then I would probably say that you're going to get away just fine with MBGA on the Raspberry Pi. But one of the most important things to talk about is sound quality, because these are two different completely pieces of hardware, and they will sound different. So go ahead and listen to the first parts of Metroid Zero Mission, first on the Pi and then on the MiSTer, and you can leave me a comment, tell me which one you think sounds better. I always like to say when I compare sound that I am not an audiophile, nor do I pretend to. I am a filmmaker with a fine art degree in direction, but those to me sound so identical that I really wouldn't be able to pick out what the source was if I was not doing this voiceover while the timeline was playing in front of me. So at least for the audio portion, MiSTer and MGBA on Raspberry Pi and RetroPie are doing the exact same thing to my ear. But again, another intro comparison, and you will just start seeing completely where the color saturation, in my opinion, is just way too low on MGBA. We're getting into those grays that are kind of almost turning muddy white versus actually being a gray. But this is an instance at least where the introductory cutscene before you get control did link up exactly frame by frame. So it seems like it's game dependent as to whether or not non-interactive cutscenes that go long are going to desync from the MiSTer core. But again, moving from Raspberry Pi over to MiSTer on Drill Dozer here, the colors, that's what I keep coming back to. Maybe you think I'm being a little bit picky or crazy about this, but to me, color is one of the most important things in gaming, and when the color's not right, it really does affect my enjoyment of it. But of course, that's my visual arts background, being a film director and cinematographer. Color is one of the most important things to me outside of framing, and obviously that doesn't change between FPGA or software emulation. And just looking at them side by side, those greens in the background are closer to an emerald green, or when you get on the right, they almost start going into the pastel color tones. Either looks good. I'm not saying one doesn't look good. I'm saying the MiSTer source looks more like my Game Boy Advance with a new screen modified into it. But that color shift is not always consistent. If you take a look here at Astro Boy, the blues are darker, they get more towards that sapphire color, but it is less of a difference compared to Drill Dozer. And of course, these are two different game sources, so you have to wait a second. There we go, we are linked up again. In the background, that poppier of a color gives a little bit more of a sense of depth to me. When the colors are a little bit flatter, a little more muted, I feel like that sense of depth in the background where you have those skyscrapers and the hill in the back actually tend to compress a little bit visually, and they don't have that same depth of field or separation of layers that I would hope to see. So again, at least for Astro Boy, MiSTer is definitely getting my vote for which I would prefer to play. But that's the thing. Raspberry Pi, RetroPie, MGBA is not doing anything wrong. These are very subjective comparisons. I can't point to a gameplay clip and say that MGBA on Raspberry Pi is screwing up. It's not making the game play correctly. I do play these games with a hardwired controller, an Xbox One controller, directly into the Raspberry Pi 4, and I do not get any sensation of lag across either the Pi or the MiSTer. So if you just want to play these games, you don't really care that much about color, and you want to buy a device, you could get away with either. I definitely prefer the MiSTer because, again, the color saturation, the look, and the feel are what I expect Game Boy Advance to look like. And that's the biggest takeaway on this video, is you get to decide subjectively what is the one you prefer. And that means that either is a great option for you. And I'm always advocating, I don't really care how you play these retro games, so long as you continue to play them. I just want it to be easy and accessible for people to enjoy games that maybe they haven't played in years, or maybe they've never experienced before. How you do that is completely up to you. But knowing what you know now, when I've talked about the colors and everything else, you tell me right now, is this Castlevania clip from MiSTer, or is it from MGBA on the Raspberry Pi on the RetroArch core? I'm curious, now that I've told you the differences between both sources, if you can identify which one you were looking at. And if most people can't, that means honestly the differences are so small that you could get away with either. But short of that, that is the MiSTer Game Boy Advance core versus RetroPie and RetroArch's MGBA core. Both are a really good option, but especially on a television, on my Samsung 4K, the look of MiSTer is just what I want to play, so I'm giving the edge to MiSTer on this comparison. I'm sure people will accuse me of being biased. I assure you I am not. So long as you play the games, I'm happy. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. Love chatting with you guys. I'll be back next week with some more MiSTer and Pi videos. I'll have videos throughout the week as well, but short of that, like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.